Hey everybody, welcome to our video on Microsoft Access databases. In this video we're going to talk specifically about how to automatically relink our front-end database to a back-end database using VBA at application startup. Now before we get into the actual content, I think there are several videos that may be useful for you to have seen before we go into this video. If you're not familiar with what I mean by split databases, I have a video here, what are they and why do it, that you can view, that goes into depth why you might want to split databases and several different ways of having those ranged. We are going to be leveraging code from these two videos, the connection string video and a writing and reading sequential files video. We're going to be reusing the code in this connection string video. We're going to be retrieving the connection strings for link tables and modifying them. We're also going to be reading from a configuration file, a text file, and potentially writing back to it. So here is a typical arrangement for a split database. You have a front-end database that holds your user interface, meaning your forms, your reports, your queries, and we put that on your user's desktop, your user's PC, potentially multiple PCs. And then we have a second database that holds all of your tables, and that one can go on one of these PCs as long as everybody can get to it, or it can go on a completely different network drive, say a file share. And each of these front-end databases have links to this back-end database. There are table entries in each database, each front-end database. They look like tables to the front-end database, but they hold a connection string that points to the location of this back-end database file. That's how the front-end databases find the tables in the back-end. So the scenario I'm trying to build code for is let me describe the scenario I'm trying to build code for here. I write databases for customers, and I do my programming work here on this machine I'm recording this video on right now. And then I carry those databases to my users' machines, my customers' machines. So I have a front-end database and a back-end database on my machine here. And my front-end database points to the folders that are on my PC here at the house. Then I carry both of these databases and put them on to my customer's machine. As soon as I do that, the links in the front-end database are broken because they're still pointing to files on my machine here at the house. They need to be pointing to files in folders that are on the customer's machine. So what I've got is code that'll run at startup. It reads a configuration file to figure out where the back end is located on their machine, and then it relinks all the tables automatically behind the scenes, and the customers never know any different, and neither do I at deployment. This helps me a lot at deployment because I can drop that an updated version of the database onto their machine, start it up, and it automatically finds the back-end database, relinks itself, and we're done. I never have to mess with the link table manager, and Ray's happy, the customers are happy, and it goes for, or helps with a speedy deployment. So let's walk through the sequence of events we're going to code for in our front end. So we're going to put this code in a form that is going to automatically open when the database starts. So it'll automatically run every time we start the database. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to have our front end attempt to read one of the tables in our back end. That's our test. Can the front end find the back end? Now you could have it test every single table. That's up to you. I'm having it test a single table. And if it can find that table, we're going to assume that all the other table links are okay. Maybe you don't want to assume that. Maybe you want to check every single table and individually and make sure they can find every one. That's up to you. But if it can read that table, then we're going to assume the links are good and the code is going to shut down. If it cannot read the table, we know that the links or the connection strings in the link table are pointing to an erroneous location on their machine. So it can't read the table. It is going to read that text file, a configuration file, which we're going to put in the same folder as the front-end database. And in that folder, and in that file is going to tell us where to look for the back end on their machine. The database will attempt to locate that back end file. If that file does not exist, it will open an open file dialog box and allow the user or the programmer who's deploying the change to locate that back end. Once we locate the back end, it will loop through all the link table entries in the front-end database, update the connection strings with the new database back-end location, and then also update the configuration file with that same folder location. So let's take a quick look at what the configuration file is going to look like. It is going to be a text file. It is going to have a single record in this text file. We're going to have two fields in this file delimited by the pipe symbol. The first field I've called backend type, and what that is going to tell us is the backend database in the same folder as the front end, or is it in a different folder from the front end? Okay, so we're going to put the word same in that first location, or the word diff, D-I-F-F. And by same, again, I mean that we have this arrangement over here. We have a folder somewhere on someone's machine, and the front end and the back end are both in that same folder. If we have front end in one folder and a back end on a different folder, or a back end on a completely different machine, say a file server, we're going to put the word diff in that first field, back end type, and then we're going to have our delimiter, our pipe, and the second field, called folder, that's going to hold the location of the folder where the back end resides. Alright, so let's take a look at our database now. I said that we wanted to have this code run when the database starts. So we have a form here. I've called it form startup, and you can do several things with this form. You could have this form act as a splash screen if you wanted. Since it's going to run at startup, automatically open up, you could put a pretty image here that somehow has some relationship to your application, and this form could show itself while the back end is relinking. Or you could just have this form be a hidden form, in which case in the form load event I would put me.visible equals false, and that would hide the entire form, and the users would never even know this code is running. Let's take a look at the code that is in this form. Alright, so what we have here is 2 lines of code in the form load event. Alright, first is call check backend. That is a method in a module, and that's what does all of our relinking for us. And then we have do command.close. We're going to close the form when all this is done. Alright, so let's close that and head over here, take a look at the real code that we got going on here. Alright, so check backend. What I've got here is I'm building a string message first. This is going to be our error message if things don't go so well. This is the message we'll show when we're not able to relink our back end. Alright, so below here, the first thing I said we wanted to do in our sequence of events was to check to see if the front end database can read one of the linked tables. So we have a function here called checkCon, short for check connection, and we're going to feed it the name of one of our tables. Now you could have a configuration table. It would have to be in your front end if you're going to do this, where you have a table name you want to check. Another thing I have hard coded here that you could put there would be the actual name of your configuration file, and maybe the name of your backend database as well. But for all those things, I have those items hard coded just to make the code here that we're talking through a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to see. So we're going to check if we can read the parts table, which is a link table. Now let's slide on down so we can see what happens in the else. Okay, there is no else. If we are able to read the parts table, then the code goes to the end and quits. Nothing else happens. Okay, like I said, I'm just checking one table to see if we have a good link to the back end. You could check all of them, in which case you would need to have a loop of some sort here, and you would probably need to do a little bit of rearranging of the code. So let's take a look at checkCon function, how that runs. Very simple. Okay, we have as input here a table string, which is a table name, and the function itself returns a boolean, true if yes it could read the table, false if it could not read the table. Okay, so the first thing we do is we dimension a record set, an RS as a DAO record set, set it equal to current DB, open record set, and just give it the table name. Something to note up here, I have on error resume next. We usually don't do this, but in this case I don't want there to be any message box popping up, because I'm just checking to see if I can read, and if I can read I'm going to interrogate the error number myself and handle it. Okay, so we don't need access popping up an error message for us. I've got on error resume next, which allows us to go from this, which is going to give us an error, to this if, where we test the return code or the error number. So if our error number is 0, that means we were capable of reading the table. We're going to set the value of our function to true, and we get out. down. Well, actually, we fall through and get out. If the error number is not 0, we had a problem reading the table. We're going to check. We're going to set the value of our function to false, fall through, close our record set, and get rid of our object, and return control back up to where we were, which is this if. So if we could not read the table, this will be false, and we'll go in to this if. First thing we want to do is find our configuration file. I said I want to always put my configuration file in the same folder as the front end of our database. So we're going to use current project.path. That gives us the path. That gives us the folder to our front end database. We have a slash here, and then I've hard coded the name of our configuration file. Again, you could put that in a configuration table in the front end if you wanted to. You will load all that concatenated into a string variable called config file that holds the location of our configuration file. Next, we want to see if we can find our configuration file. We could have an error, right, and it doesn't exist. So we're going to check for the existence of our configuration file by using the dir function. If dir config file is not equal to spaces, that means it does exist. If it's equal to spaces, or if it's equal to a zero-length string, that means it does not exist. So if it's not equal to a zero-length string, it does exist, and we can go into this if. The first thing we want to do is we want to read our configuration file. So we're going to get the first free file number using the free file function, load it into the file num variable. Then we're going to open the config file. This is the string we just built from up here. Open the config file for input using the file num we just obtained. And then we're going to read the first record from the file. Now, not only are we assuming that there's a single record in this file, but we're going to make sure that there's a single record in this file. Okay? Whenever we rewrite this file, we're going to write a single record to it. When we build it for the first time manually, we're going to put a single record in there. Okay? So here's our line input pound statement, reading the file num and loading what we find on the record into this string file line. And we're going to close this file immediately, because in a later call, depending upon what happens, we might want to write out a new record to that file, and we'll get an error if that file is still open, so we want to close it immediately. So file line is a string that holds the contents of that record in that file. If file line is a zero-length string, we have two variables we're going to set to spaces, or to a zero-length string. If there is something in file line, then we're going to split that string on the vertical pipe symbol. Remember, we had two fields in that file delimited by the symbol. So we use the split function on the file line string, telling it to split on the pipe symbol, and we're going to load it into string line array. That is a variant, dimensioned as a variant up here. All right. The first element of that array, the 0 element, we're going to load into a variable called setup type. That's going to hold the word same or diff, or potentially spaces if we have an error. Okay. And the second element of that array, item number 1, we're going to load into folder location. That's going to hold the location or the folder that holds our backend database if it's on a different folder. The next thing we're going to do then is test the setup type, this first element in the array, same or diff. Select case statement here for that. Okay, if it's same or it's a zero-length string, there was nothing in there, we're going to call our relink driver function. We're going to look at it in just a minute here. If it's diff in a different folder, we're going to call the same function. We're just going to give it different input. Okay, so this takes 3 items of input. First, it takes the actual name of the backend database, not the path, but just a hard-coded name. Again, you could obtain that from a configuration table if you wanted to. It's in your front end. This function also takes a setup type, meaning it takes the word same or diff, and it takes the folder it's supposed to look in for this database. So under the case of same, we're going to give it current project.path, because that is the path to our front end. If we've told it it's in a different folder, meaning under diff here, we're going to give it the folder location that it pulled from the configuration file. That's the folder it should look in. Now, relink driver returns a Boolean value as well. It returns true if it successfully relinked the tables. It returns false if it did not. So we have an if here, if relink driver equals false. We're going to pop up a message box that holds the message that the string message we built way up top here, saying you've got a big problem, we couldn't relink. Call your developer. If it's true, if it did relink, we're just going to fall all the way through and get on out. And I want to point out very quickly before we move on, okay, if this were true, or if this one were true, either one, we're going to pop out of this and select. We'll go past this else and get out of the if, and go down here to this message box. Relinking successful. Now, I would not put this message box in a live database that customers are using. Okay, that means that every time the database starts, this message box is probably going to pop up and say this, and it's not necessary if things are going well. Okay, I've got it here for us, for our purposes, to see it in the video, to see that our code is run. But for real database, get rid of that. Okay. Okay, so back up here to relink driver. What does relink driver do? There we go. It's a little bit longer. And relink driver takes three variables as input: the name of the backend database, the backend type, same or diff, and then the path to look in for this backend database. And it returns a Boolean value, true if it could relink tables and false if it could not. The first thing we're going to do is check to see if we received a path as input. If we did not receive a path, we receive a zero length string or spaces. We're going to set the path we're going to look for equal to the current project.path, being the location of our front end. We just need to get this code running, because if it can't find the back end, it's going to ask the users to tell it where the back end is. But we need to give it a place to look so we can get to that point in the code. So we're going to load this string search path with current project path. If we did receive a string path, we'll follow on through here, and we're going to check to see if the backend database that we were told to look for exists. So we have a file name here. We're going to concatenate it to the search path we were just told to look in. Okay, if we're going to use the dir function, if this file exists, we're going to concatenate the path with the backend database name into this variable, string file name. That should hold the full path and file name to the backend database. If that file does not exist, we go into the else, and that's when we're going to call a function that's going to display our open file dialog. Now, I'm not going to look at this code again because I keep showing it in almost every video I do lately. You can look at the Microsoft Office file dialog video of mine. It was done several months ago, if you want to see more detail how that works. But if this database does not exist, this backend does not exist, we're going to ask the customers or whoever is starting the database to locate the backend. We'll come out of there with a name, hopefully a file name, and string file name. If we didn't make a choice, if we couldn't find the backend, we'll come out of that with string file name being a zero length string, in which case we want to get out. We're going to tell them we couldn't find the backend database, or you canceled the search for it, and we're going to go to subexit and get out. Okay, so assuming that we did locate the backend and populated that variable with the file name, get down to the business of actually trying to relink these tables. We're going to call another function, refresh links. And again, it returns a Boolean value. True if it were successful. True if it was successful relinking the tables. False if it could not. So let's take a look at refresh links. It takes as input the full path and file name to the backend database that holds the tables. We dimension a table def object here and a string to hold our connection string. And we set up a for each loop here, and there's our next. For each table def in our current DB table defs collection, there is an entry for each table in your database in this table defs collection. Okay, a table def object for each table in your database. We'll want to only work on linked tables, so we're going to test the length of the table def.connect property. That holds the connection string to your table. If it's a local table in your front end, this connection string will be a 0-length string. If there's anything in this connection string, then you've got a linked table, and those are the ones we want to relink. So if the length of this connection string is greater than 0, we're going to enter this if. First thing we need to do is check to see if there's a password on that table or that database. And if it is, get that password, because we're going to need it when we rebuild our connection string. And that's all this code here does. Okay, we locate the PWD equals entry in the connection string and extract the password that's next to it, and we load it into this string variable, db pwd, db password. Next, we're going to build a connection string for this table. Connection string equals ms access semicolon pwd equals, and there's the password we just built or just pulled from the connection string, semicolon database equals. This is where the full path and file name goes. It holds the table. And from here we're going to check to see if we need to relink this table. We're going to compare the tabledef.connect, the connection string, the current one, compare it to the connection string we just built. If they are different, we need to update that connection string. So we'll set the tabledef.connect property equal to the connection string. We're going to show the users we're doing something by putting a little message linking to and table name down here. Tabledef.name, that's the table name. We're going to show that in our little status bar at the bottom of the window, the access window. And then we're going to use this tabledef.refreshLink method. This is the method that actually saves the connection string in the tabledef object. If you don't do this, you don't actually update the connection string. Then we're going to check our error code after we've done that, called that refreshLink method. And if it's not equal to 0, we have a problem. We're going to set the value of our function, refreshLinks, to false, and we're going to exit the function. If we got an error code of 0 here, that means we were able to update the connection string, and we just follow on through and go to the next linked table in the database. If we get all the way to the bottom here, loop all through all our tables, we'll set function equal to true, meaning we were successful in refreshing the links to all of our tables, and we can return control back up to where we were, which is this if right here. So if we got a true from that, we'll go into this if and finish up. And what we want to do here is, by finishing up, is determine if we need to write a new folder value or a new backend type to our configuration file. So first we're going to get the folder that we ended up with in our connection string, or holding our backend, using the left function on the file name for our backend, looking for the last slash. Everything after the last slash is the actual database name itself, or the file name itself. Then we're going to compare that folder that's actually holding the backend to the folder that holds our front end. If they are the same, if they are equal, then we want to make sure that our configuration file is set up correctly to have the word same in it in that first field. So we're going to set a variable called backend type equal to same, and in that situation we have our file folder and that configuration file equal to a 0-length string. Now if the location of our front end is different from the location that's holding our backend, we'll set that backend type variable equal to diff. And then go on down here, we're going to build the name for our configuration file again, putting it in this string variable, get our next open file number, stored in file num. We're going to open our configuration file for output this time, using our file number. Now I'm going to use output here. Output, when you use open for output, it completely replaces the contents of the file with whatever you write this time you open it. And that's what we want to do. We want to have a single record in this configuration file that holds the location of our backend. So we're opening it for output. We're going to wipe out the contents of the file and replace it with this new content. We're either putting the word same or diff in the first position of our file or of our record. We're going to concatenate onto that our pipe delimiter, and then we're going to put the contents of the folder that holds our backend. And up here, notice we've either set that equal to a 0-length string if it's in the same folder, or it holds the folder right here that holds the backend. That goes into the string called file line, And then we're going to use our print pound method to write to the file, writing the string to the file number we obtained above. And if all that goes well, we'll set relink driver, our function, equal to true. If that did not go well, we'll set equal to false, and then we get out of here. Actually, before we get out, we close our file. And then we get out. And we're going to return control to where we were way up here, which is the calling of relink driver. Remember, where we were up here is we were looking at whether our backend was in the same folder as our front end or in a different folder from our front end. And we call a relink driver in both of those cases, and we called it with different input. Right? We either called it with the path to the front end or the path from our configuration file. So either one of these is going to pop us out all the way down to here. Hopefully successful. Now there is an else we need to deal with here. Let me back up so we can see the beginning of this if. Okay, so this is if the configuration file exists. If it doesn't exist, here's our else for that. The configuration file does not exist. We can't find it. We're still going to call relink driver. We're just going to give it the location of our front end database and tell it just start looking there. Start looking in the front end folder. And again, if it can't find the back end there, it's going to, just like it did a minute ago, it's going to pop up the open file dialog and let you try to locate the back end folder, the back end file for it. And again, we pop out to our message box that we only want to show here in development and not to our customers. And that's it for the code. Let's have a quick demonstration. And we pull over an Explorer window here. So here's the front end database that we have open right now. Here's the back end. It is in the same folder. The back end is in the same folder as the front end. Let's take a look at our configuration file. Split config text. I've got the word same followed by our vertical pipe. Let's close that guy now. Let's move this window out of the way. Let's try to query the parts table. And there we go. We can get to the parts table. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to break the back end, break the links. We're going to cut this back end. I'm going to go up one level to this folder. Okay. And paste my back end there. Let's move this out of the way. Let's try to query the parts table now. We get an error message saying we cannot get to the table. See, it says cannot find file, and there's the name of our backend that it was expecting. That's the name of the backend that's in the connection string. And we can even take a look at these connection strings. There we go. There's our form from a previous video. Holds our connection strings. For each of the three tables that we have, our link tables. There's the full file. Notice we had the backend in this subfolder test writes. I just moved it to this access to DB's folder. I moved it from here to here. So now let's see what happens when we start this form. So it tried to locate the backend in the same folder as the front end, which is this test writes folder. And the backend doesn't exist there. So it's opened up the file dialog for us. And actually, just by chance, we are in the right folder already. So we'll select this file. We click open. We get our message saying it's relinked successfully. We can test that. See, we now can get to the table, and we can refresh our connection strings in this form. You can see now the test write folder is gone. Now it's pointing to this folder. And let's pull our Explorer window back over here, go in here and take a look at what we wrote to our configuration file. And there we go. We wrote the word diff, and we wrote the folder that it was in. So now, the next time we would run this code, we shouldn't get that that dialog box, right? It should just run right through, and it should say it can find the table, and it should say relink successful and be done. I had this code in every database that I deploy that is a split database because it speeds up deployment of updates by so much. Okay, you can take your new copy of your database and copy it onto your customer's machine, and then it takes care of figuring out where the back end is and relinks itself. See, if we're deploying an update, you've already got that configuration file sitting on their machine. It's just sitting there waiting in the folder with the front end. So you put your new front end in that same folder, it finds configuration file, it knows where the database, the backend database is, relinks to tables, and it just goes for such a smoother deployment. It's quick, you don't have to mess with the link table manager, and it's just things go much faster. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.